Awesome. Well, as a reminder, we do host these workflow demos the last Wednesday of every month. I know that's not today, but next week with the holiday, we moved it a week earlier. But all of the sessions are recorded, and we do have over 20 different workflows now. So I'll share the link to the full playlist in the YouTube chat in just a minute here, as well as the calendar link if you want to add the monthly recurring event to your calendar. But I also want to add that I know many people who join some these workflows are current customers, but if you are new to Posit Team and are curious about learning more, want to try it out for free, feel free to let us know here in the chat. You can also book time with our team, and we'll share those links in the chat in just a second too. But I just wanted to go around and quickly do some introductions here. So I'm Rachel. I lead customer marketing here at Posit. I'm based in the Boston area, and I also host our data science hangout that we have every Thursday. Isabella, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabella Velasquez. I work on the developer relations team here at Posit, and really excited to be here. I'll pass it to Sara.
Yeah. Hi again. I'm Sara. I'm also on the developer relations team at Posit.
All right. And I'm Ryan. Many of you folks probably recognize me at this point. I've been on a few of these demos. I'm a data science advisor here at Posit. That falls underneath our solutions engineering team. I delivered a few of these sessions in the past, but really I'm just kind of here to help out with random questions y'all may have about the workflow, but also just Posit Team in general.
Awesome. Well, I saw a few questions were about Posit Team and about the specific products, like there were questions about Connect or Workbench. And Ryan, I thought it might be helpful to just, if we could do a quick overview for everybody, that might help in the Q&A session too.
Absolutely. Can you all see my screen okay?
I just pulled it over. Yep.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so it'd probably just be good to give you a quick primer on what is Posit Team, and I'm going to describe it from the perspective of a data scientist, which I'm going to assume many of you all here today are probably data enthusiasts that are working with data, potentially reading and writing to databases. So Posit Team is a bundled offering of our 3 professional tools, and the first tool I just want to touch upon is Posit Workbench. So Posit Workbench is a server-based implementation of the RStudio IDE, as well as Jupyter Lab, Jupyter Notebook, VS Code, and real excitingly, we just added preview support for Positron. But this is going to be your development environment. So when you're writing code, you're creating Shiny applications, you're reading and writing data from a database, you're going to be doing it within Posit Workbench. And I know there was a question about, is there like a cloud-based version of Posit Workbench we can all access. Our professional tools, these are tools that sit on top of servers, Linux servers that your team manages. That could be an on-prem server. It could be a server running in AWS or Azure or some other cloud environment. So these are tools that you would install on servers that you maintain within your group. But once you've created something like a Shiny application, for example, you're going to then publish it to Posit Connect. So Posit Connect is our professional publishing platform, which allows you to easily and securely share content with whoever you want. That could be, your coworker sitting right next to you. It could be a coworker on the other side of the world. It could be anyone that you want. Now, I know there was also a question about like authentication and how do you securely share those insights. So both Posit Workbench and Posit Connect will typically be tied into whatever authentication your team uses. So in order to access Workbench, you will need to log in. Same for Posit Connect. And then when you go to share content with someone, you do have the ability to share it with other folks that are within your team's authentication system. And depending on your license type, you can share things like interactive applications more broadly with the entire world. But again, that does require a specific Posit Connect license. And if that's of interest to your team, just reach out to your Posit customer success manager, and we'd be happy to kind of start those conversations. And then just to round it out, our third professional tool, Posit Package Manager, does exactly as its name implies. It helps manage, organize, centralize, deliver all those amazing open source packages your team may be using in both R and Python. And so this is what kind of a centralized repository, so to speak, that can feed both Posit Workbench and Posit Connect in your environment. So there you go.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Mhm.
Ryan. I realize that answers some of these questions that were coming in, like how do we publish Shiny, or do I need to download Posit Workbench? So if anybody has follow-up questions on those, if those were ones you submitted, feel free to add more into the YouTube chat as well. But jumping over to some other questions, one was, do I need to use DBplier or can I use DBplier directly? I don't know, Sarah, do you want to get started with this one?
Great. Yeah. Um, so I guess it depends on what you're doing in your app and why you're asking. So in the R version of the app that I showed, if you look at the code, I don't think I actually load DBplier because you're using DuckDB, but it's same kind of concept where you're using the DBplier interface, like you're using all those familiar looking DBplier verbs, but then interacting with a database table. And it's doing that lazy evaluation where it's not running the entire query unless you're asking for it. So if you want to interact with the database in that way, where you only want to run the full query when you need to or you force it to, then you will want to use DBplier. But if you just want to grab your data from the database and turn it into um, something that's locally stored or whatever, you can use collect and then use dplyr. I think did we link to the first database blog post, Rachel, in the
Yep.
that one I think explains in a little bit more detail than this Shiny blog post and the demo how collect works. On the R side, where you're taking your database table and pulling it all into R, and then you can use dplyr directly. But I guess at a high level, like whether you're using dbplier or dplyr, the experience is pretty similar because you can still use dplyr verbs to interact with your database table, like except in sort of specific cases. Um, yeah, I hope that answers the question. Feel free to ask follow-ups in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, and great call out to the blog post too, because I meant to say that in the beginning. There are some great posts that Sarah has put out the last few months, so I want to make sure to share them here right now in the chat with you. But Isabella, you had also mentioned a few other blog posts that might be useful. Do you want to speak to those too?
Yeah, absolutely. This was related to one of the questions, like asking about speed and the advantages of using one tool over the other. And the community has put out several really great posts. Rachel, I just shared with you, if you don't mind sharing them, please. One is by Stephen Turner that talks about DuckDB, DBplier, and base R. Another one is by Art Steinmetz, which talks about the different kind of wrappers around tidyverse. So we've been talking about DBplier, there's DuckDB, DTplier, and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of great resources in terms of like if speed is very important to your workflow, how you can kind of compare and then decide what package is the right one for you.
Awesome, thank you. And I will grab these links as well to go put them in the resources with the full demo as well, if anything's not there yet. Okay, so another question that came in was, what is the speed of connections to the cloud database as compared to local, if this was something we could touch upon?
Yeah, if whoever wrote this question, if you want to put some more context in the chat, that could be helpful. Or did you want to talk about the speed comparison blog post a little bit more, Isabella? I'm not sure if this is asking like if you have local data, is it helpful to do something with a database to speed things up? Or like if you have data, you have the same data in the cloud database and you want to move it local, or the connection itself to the cloud versus local. So, but yeah, that one of the, is it the Stephen Turner blog post is comparing like using DuckDB versus dplyr versus base R for like the same data, but that's not really considering like where it might be stored and how you would store it, just the speed of operations. I think that's what it's getting at.
Yeah. We could definitely look into it more, but if the person who has more context, please let us know, and we'll also include more links when we finalize this YouTube video.
Sounds good. And I was going to add into the chat that if there's ever a question that you think would be better for like a conversation where we're not trying to talk through YouTube, you can always schedule time to chat with our team. So I'll just share this on the screen here. Okay, let's jump over to some other questions because some people submit questions ahead of time as well when they registered. And one was, I'm particularly interested in user authentication. And I know that was covered in one of the blogs mentioned, so would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I briefly talked about this in the demo, but yeah, one way to manage access to your Shiny app if you're making something like we showed today is to have the users authenticate to the app. So that first method I showed, like I showed you how you, I think there was a question about this in the chat as well to talk a little bit more about the adding the key to in Posit Connect. So that method was we were adding like one key to Posit Connect. So then when you go and look at the app, it's using that key or password or whatever things we have put in Connect, and then using that to connect to the database. So if you want each user to be able to authenticate, you have a couple options. One is to like set something up yourself where you have something in your Shiny app that allows people to enter their credentials, and then you use those credentials to authenticate. And then the other one that I talked a little bit about is about using the OAuth integration. So this is now supported in Connect. Maybe we can like link to that documentation in the chat or something, or I can grab it after this. But with OAuth integration, you don't have to like write any of that code yourself to like figure out the credentials. You just need to write some code that like passes them along to your connection code. And that's nice because you can use OAuth for something like Snowflake or Databricks if you're using those for your database, and then let OAuth sort of handle the things on the security side.
Thank you. Yeah, if you have that specific link to the documentation, I'm happy to share that over there in YouTube as well. So another question I wanted to just pull up here real quickly is a little bit more technical. And so I wanted to just pull this up briefly to just say, if you have specific questions like this, which might need us to dive in a little bit deeper, I'd also encourage you to use the Posit community forum. So that's a great place to go if you need help with anything from building a Shiny application or deploying a Streamlit app to Posit Connect. So I'm going to share the community forum with you here in the chat as well. And so our team, as well as the broader community, monitors that and can give you some help and insight in there. So I'll just share that in the chat. And I see some questions coming in the YouTube chat live as well. So Sukesh just asked, how do I use Shiny for user workflows such as user data input, correction, or context through app and updating it across a database instantaneously?
Okay, let me just make sure I understand the question. Okay, so my understanding, are you asking like if you, instead of what we did in the demo where you're like updating an existing table, if the user is inputting data, or is correction context like the same kind of thing we were doing in the demo app where you're editing an existing value? I'm not sure. I think in general, like the general workflow, I think, would be similar. You need a way to capture that input in your Shiny app and then a way to update the database. So for the one I showed, we were using an editable table because we wanted the user to be able to like edit a specific value. But the general workflow isn't dependent upon that editable table. Like that could have been a button or something else that allows you to update that value. And I think the general idea would be the same, where you need a way to capture that, and then reactively update it where it needs to be updated, and then have a way to write it back to the database after seeing that the user has updated some value. But I'm not sure if you're asking something more specific. So yeah, again, feel free to add more context in the chat, because I'd love to be helpful.
I'll let you know if I see
Cool.
anything else pop up there. Okay, let's go to another question. Oh, Sukesh did add, he said editable table and text forms as inputs.
Okay. Yeah, so the example I actually showed did use editable tables. So I think you could take a look at that code. A text form, I guess like a text box or something like that, would work slightly differently. But again, I think the general idea would be similar. You need a way to capture that input with some kind of input element in your Shiny app, and then a way to write that change back to the database. Yeah, so I think in this case, I think a text form would even be simpler in this case than the editable table, because making sure that the user is editing something in the editable table that you want them to edit, it's the right kind of input, all that requires some extra code. I guess you would also need to validate in your text form to make sure they're not putting something back in your database that you don't want there. So maybe that's also something to consider. But yeah, I'd say take a look at the example code.
Thank you. I see Amelia had asked a question. I'd love to hear about any good rules of thumb for building, developing, and maintaining Shiny apps collaboratively. So, for example, multiple analysts are responsible for implementation feature enhancements.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is not something that I know a lot about, because I tend to make Shiny apps by myself. But do you have either of you have anything or any resources we can point them to?
I would say at least the first thing I would mention is that you should probably leverage some type of version control for this, and all that collaborative work should be done on a repository. It's never a really good idea to do like, someone develops a Shiny application, then copy and paste it in like a Slack channel and send it to your colleague that way. So it's much better, much more organized. You can approve changes. You can work on multiple branches. So certainly using version control. And another advantage with Posit Connect is you can actually publish a piece of content to Connect directly from a GitHub repository or some type of Git repository, which can be
Yeah.
really helpful for collaborative work.
One thing that also could be good to know about is Shiny Lives. Like if you are, I think Shiny Live is nice. You might not want to build your entire app there, but if you are working on an app together and want to just like show people the current functionality of it, or like you have a bug and you want help with it, you can paste a bit of code in Shiny Live and then easily share that with the other people you're working on, or for someone you're asking for help. And I can grab a link to Shiny Live if people aren't familiar with it. But it's a way to run Shiny applications in the browser.
So many great resources here. I'm excited to share these on LinkedIn right after as well. Isabella, do you want to comment on the Mastering Shiny one you shared too?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. I think, recently a friend was asking about like our packages and kind of similar sort of setup, like how do I work collaboratively? And the Mastering Shiny book does have a section on best practices and a specific one on kind of like the software development, like Ryan mentioned, like the idea of version control and things like that. And so definitely check it out, and I hope it's helpful.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Oh, let me also jump over to Slido. So we have a lot of places you can ask questions. It was when you registered in Slido if you want to ask anonymously, or in the YouTube chat here. But somebody asked, if I deploy this type of app to Posit Connect and multiple people use it simultaneously, can they both write to the database if they aren't submitting simultaneously?
Yeah, so this will depend on your database and how you have things set up. So for DuckDB, like generally, it doesn't allow you to write simultaneously to write concurrently to the same connection, and it's not really set up to do that, in my understanding. Um, the example app, like if you go and look at it, you all can open it up and write and do whatever you want with it simultaneously because it's like spinning up a new database every time you load that app. It's using an in-memory database. And I did that just so it wasn't confusing when many people were writing to one place. But you don't know that they're using the app. So like suddenly things have changed. But also because of this concurrency issue. But like I said, I think that's just like not really what DuckDB is designed for. But other databases um, are not DuckDB and are designed for that, and will have like I guess different considerations. Um, so I guess my general answer is it depends, and it'll depend on how you have things set up. But you might need to think about what you want to happen if two people are writing to the database at the same time, and think about like, do you want that to be able to happen? If someone writes a change, do you want your app to automatically update? How do you want to manage that? Um, and did we find any resources for managing concurrency?
If you want
Yes,
to put
but
them
we
in
will
our
look afterwards.
private chat, we can add them into the resources. So there's a lot of questions on DuckDB specifically as well. And I don't want to forget to say this, but I mentioned in the beginning that I also host our data science hangout. And so every Thursday, we have a leader from the community who joins to answer questions from you all. And actually, tomorrow is the last hangout of 2024. And Hannes, the co founder of DuckDB Labs, is going to be our featured leader. So if there are any follow-up questions about DuckDB or anything you want to ask Hannes, I'll share the link to the data science hangout right now, and you can add that to your calendar as well. So it's Thursday from 12 to 1 Eastern time, and that will also be recorded. But I put this question up here. Is there anything you three want to add to this or have to say on this matter?
Yeah, I think that would be a great question for Honest. Yeah, I did find some useful documentation on this. If I can put that in the chat.
Okay.
Grab that.
Maybe a broad, shiny question. Somebody asked, what are the ongoing maintenance requirements for deployed Shiny apps to the cloud?
Yeah,
Maybe
That's a
if
good
we think
question.
of our own
Ryan,
apps deployed here.
might be a question for you.
I mean, I've worked with teams that have developed the Shiny application and haven't touched it in a decade. And it works and it still provides a lot of value to that team. So, to borrow an answer from Sarah, it depends on what your application is doing and what it depends on. So, um, but yeah, I mean, open source data science, it's a very fast moving environment, as you all know. So sometimes things need to be updated, but again, depends on how you build that Shiny application. It can be very stable for a very long time, or it may require constant kind of tweaks. And then specifically like to the cloud, I'm not sure what kind of specific requirements, you all were thinking of, but I wouldn't really think there'd be anything out of the ordinary.
Okay. Awesome. Anything else we want to add to that? We're good. Okay. There was a question about Ibis, which I can't find right now, but I know, Sarah, you wanted to speak to this.
Yeah. So the question I have was it necessary to use Ibis in the Python app, or could you have connected to DuckDB in other ways? Yeah, so not necessary to use Ibis. If you don't want to use Ibis for some reason, you don't have to. That was just that's just one approach. And again, like we were using Ibis in this case to connect to the database, and then we also used Ibis to write the code that interacts with that table. And so one other option is there is a Python API to DuckDB. So if you're using DuckDB and just didn't want to use Ibis, you can directly use the Python API. I think I might have used that initially and then switched to Ibis. You could copy that link, Rachel. And then there's, yeah, other options that will do a very similar thing, like allow you to create a connection to a database and then manipulate that data. I think Ibis is just a good choice. Ibis is nice because it has so many backends that you can use. Like you can connect to a variety of databases. So as I showed in that first blog post that we linked at some point, the like introduction to connecting to databases or something, the code can look very similar as you're moving between things like DuckDB, Snowflake, or Databricks, or whatever database you're using. So it's nice that you can sort of reuse the code and you don't have to like switch too much. Whereas some of the things in the DuckDB API are like specific to DuckDB and the way they do things, but it also has a pretty familiar looking API as well. So that is also a good option.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for maybe one more question here. Let's see, Isabella, do you see any on Slido that we haven't answered yet?
Sorry, I'm not 100% sure. Have you asked this one?
Nope. Okay, so another question, let me copy it over so you can see it on the screen, was in your example, the database was bundled with the app, but when deployed to Posit Connect, the storage is not persistent. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. It's not persistent in that, like, when you refresh the app or if someone loads it, they are not going to see those changes that you made to the flag column. And again, this is partially by design for the purposes of the example, because I think if you were making this in real life, like for your organization, obviously you would want people to be able to change that data and then for other people to see those changes. But in this case, if you're all loading it, like it doesn't really make sense for you to see your changes. And it's also nice because it's not dependent on anything external. So you can clone this repository and run the app yourself without worrying about like connecting to something that we've set up. So in that way, the storage is not persistent by design. But I think if you had persistence, like if you have persistent storage set up somewhere else, I think you could like, my hope is that you can sort of apply the code to that situation by just like editing how you have connected to the database. Yeah. Anything you want to add, Isabella? It looked like maybe you were going to say something. Okay. Never mind.
Awesome. Well, I know this workflow example is just one example of ways that you could do this, but teams have so many different databases or tools internal to their organization. And so whether that's Databricks or Snowflake or using DuckDB, we hope to make examples that can be relevant to you specifically. So if there are other things that you'd like to see, feel free to let us know in the chat. I think, Isabella, you just shared there's one quick question you wanted us to cover. So let me throw that in here as well. So real quick, just a quick question. Is it okay to create a connection object as a reactive object value?
Yeah, so I'm going to say yes. Unfortunately, the way that we're sharing code or text is cutting off the code. I just shared it with you, Rachel, in Slack. I don't know if YouTube also has a limit, but you are able to create a connection object as a reactive object.
Okay. Well, I don't think it will let me share
Yeah.
code in YouTube here, but maybe
Well,
Isabella, if you could put it into the recording right after this, we
sounds
could
good.
do that for whoever asked this question too. If we have your name too, we can follow up with you directly. But as I was mentioning, we want to make these examples that are most exciting to you as well. So if you have suggestions for workflows, let us know. Somebody did give us a suggestion for the one that's going to be covered in January. So we're going to do a deeper dive on vetiver and model cards. So thank you so much to Chris who had asked for that. But thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And a huge thank you to you, Sara, for the great demo as well. Thank you, Ryan and Isabella, for jumping in here too. Always fun to have this whole crew here for the Q&A. One more very quick note. I have so many exciting things to share with you all. Registration for PositConf is now open. So if you want to join us at the conference next year in Atlanta, you can register to do so. And this is the lowest price that you'll ever see for the conference. So I just put that in the chat as well. So many links that we've shared with you. I know we keep saying that over and over again, but I'm going to right now go and take all those links and put it in the YouTube description too, so you have them there in one easy spot. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the day.